Good evening, everyone. My name is Ben, and I'm here on behalf of the Hospital Research Foundation Group Arthritis. And I'd like to thank everyone for joining us again for another one of these arthritis webinars. First and foremost, I'd like to acknowledge that all three of us presenters today present from Ghana land, and we acknowledge their elders past, present, and emerging. I'd also like to state this webinar has been made possible through funding from the Country SA Primary Health Network, and that the questions and answers will be open the entire time. Now, whilst both presenters are health professionals, all advice that can be given is general in nature. So this webinar, really excited about it. We've called it Arthritis, What's Stress Got to Do with It? And really what we're looking at is two different presenters who work together, but really looking at stress in two different ways about arthritis, as I'm sure they'll both go through, with really looking at, can stress cause arthritis? And then really can arthritis kind of cause stress as well? So should be really good. Our two presenters today are Sarah Schwetlik, who's a physiotherapist, arthritis researcher, and then Sally Goodwin, who's a health psychologist. Sarah Schwetlik is a physiotherapist who works in both the rheumatology and spinal assessment clinics within the Central Adelaide Local Health Network. Sarah recently completed her Masters of Research in 2022, looking into the connections between chronic stress and arthritis. Sally Goodwin is a health psychologist with experience in the Central Adelaide Local Health and Network Rheumatology Service and private practices. She currently leads an allied health group program at the Queen Elizabeth Hospital, supporting individuals with arthritic conditions to actively manage their healthcare. Sally has a special interest in using psychology to improve the quality of life for people facing ongoing health challenges. So our first presenter tonight will be Sarah, and I'll hand over to her.
Okay. Thanks very much, Ben, first for inviting us here, and then also for that very kind introduction. And thanks to everyone who's tuned in tonight to hear about arthritis and what does stress have to do with it. A quick overview before we jump in. The things we're going to talk about tonight are what is stress? What does stress have to do with arthritis? What's happening in our nervous system when we experience stress? And how can we reduce that impact of stress on our health and well-being when we're living with arthritis? So how did we get here? Why would we want to talk about stress? The evidence is growing that shows stress has real impacts on our health. When it comes to arthritis, there's traditionally been more focus on things like genes and mechanics and aging as causes, but mainstream medicine is gradually starting to look much more holistically at the influence of other social and psychological factors. So we're really starting to zoom out from just looking at the joints and seeing the whole person with arthritis. And because of this, it's important for us to then consider, well, how could stress get under our skin and actually influence arthritis? And then what could we do about it? So what is stress? It's a normal part of everyday living. It's an essential inbuilt mechanism that helps us survive, and it's helped us evolve and thrive over time. Stress might look different to each of us, and we'd all come tonight with different views on stress, but it is a common experience to us all. Stress sets off a range of responses. We most commonly might identify these as a fight or flight type of response. So a big part of the stress response is physiological. And by that, I mean the processes that are occurring behind the scenes in our body, in our internal organs and in our cells. Things like a release of chemicals into our bloodstream. Now, we can't feel that release, but we might then feel the effects of these processes. There are also behavioural responses, and this refers to the actions that we take when we're under stress. And then there are emotional responses. So this means how we feel when we're stressed, like being overwhelmed or being excited, in fact. Sometimes these emotions themselves can be hard to name, but we might just recognise this combined emotional sort of state of I feel stressed. Now, I want you to just stop and imagine for a minute that you're being chased by a tiger. Now, for most of us, we'd expect this to trigger a pretty strong stress response. But what's actually happening in our body? So there's a flood of chemicals released that causes increases to your heart rate, breathing, and blood pressure. This starts to get more blood and oxygen to your muscles. Your alertness is increased and you'll feel laser focused on getting to safety or reducing the danger. And these changes allow survival actions like running away from the tiger or fighting it. Your body turns down unnecessary activity for survival, like digestion, reproduction, rest, and other cognitive processes. You know, we probably don't need to worry about digesting that big lunch we had when a tiger's chasing after us. So then when you found safety, everything should gradually return to baseline. So our body adapts in the short term to that stressful situation, and then it reverts back once the coast is clear. So now we don't need all of that extra oxygen, so our heart rate can slow down. We can return to focusing on the problem that we were dealing with beforehand. We can digest our lunch or have good sleep. Everything just reverts back to normal. And you can probably see how this stress response is helpful to us in the short term. But what about long-term or repeated activation of our stress response? So now imagine that that tiger is there all the time. It follows you all day long and it's in your room at night. It's a constant threat. And this is akin to a chronic stressor. So chronic stressors can take many forms. And I've just listed some of them here. They might include things like money worries, strained relationships, past experiences like violence or childhood traumas. They can also be more everyday kind of experiences. So that constant flood of emails that you feel completely overwhelmed by, or not knowing whether you're going to be able to continue staying in your rental housing, or if you're going to need to try and find another place to live. Having to organise all of your family, getting everyone in the right place at the right time, and also making sure you've got dinner on the table every night too. The steady stream of medical appointments that you need to attend to keep on top of your health. And what about dealing with pain? I mean, that certainly can be a chronic stressor. These are just examples though. They might not all lead to chronic stress, but the point is that all sorts of things can be chronically stressful, not just major life events, and we don't always recognise them as stressful. Some of those examples might have resonated with you and some of them won't. It's worth pointing out at this point that the way we perceive or we view a potential stressor and how we react to it is very individual from one person to the next. Each of us are shaped by our unique genes, the experiences we've had in our life, and also the current context or situation that we find ourselves in. All of this determines how we see that stressor and our stress response. For example, if you're afraid of snakes, even the thought of going into the bush on a hot summer's day might be enough to set off a stress response for you. But if you're a snake catcher, then chances are you're someone who can remain calm and keep that stress response at bay when you're dealing with snakes. Stress is rarely a black and white kind of phenomenon. It exists on this long continuum. Stress isn't always a bad thing. And some of us may feel that we sometimes experience a good kind of stress. And this is something that people sometimes ask me about. This kind of good stress usually involves a time-limited stressor. So we know the end point, and a bit of stress can kind of act as a bit of a motivator for us to get things done. We feel in this case that we're able to manage the emotional, physical, and physiological changes that the stress response is producing. That said, it might still involve responses that aren't ideal for our health, like staying up all night to meet a deadline. The stress may be balanced by other factors like resilience, and Sally's going to discuss these things a little bit later on tonight. There may also be a reward at the end, like a mad panic to get things organised and pack the car before you go on a road trip. So the important thing to remember here is that we all have a varying tolerance for stress, and the point at which we go from good stress to stressed out and from coping to not coping varies too. So it's really best to avoid comparing ourselves to others. And what we're focused on tonight is that chronically stressed out end for an individual. Let's come back now to what happens when we're exposed to stress over a prolonged period of time or repeatedly. So that scenario where the tiger is there following us all the time, that constant threat. In this situation, our body can start to make changes and adapt to that stressor in the long term. So things don't return to their normal or resting state. So we can have cardiovascular changes. Our blood pressure remains elevated. We start to get more buildup of cholesterol in our blood vessels. Our metabolism is affected. So our body's tolerance for glucose or sugars changes, and our blood sugars can increase as a result. Our body may produce more inflammatory chemicals, being ready to fight off any infections that come our way, but leaving us with this chronic, what we call low-grade inflammation. Our body gets better at producing fatty tissues, which can cause weight gain. And the fatty tissue itself further changes our metabolism and releases more inflammatory chemicals. With chronic stress, those functions not necessary for short-term survival, like digestion and rest that we talked about before, may stay turned down. So we don't sleep so well, and our gut may start giving us grief and becoming sensitive. This is where we start to see that short-term stress is okay, but being stressed all the time actually changes things in our body that may then affect our health in the longer term. These changes I've described here are also all individually linked with arthritis, and many with increased pain as well. These changes are ways our body tries to adapt to being in a state of constant stress and threat. And this process of adaptation is something called allostatic loading. The theory of allostatic load suggests that it's the combined and cumulative effect of all of these changes that can really have consequences for our health in the longer term. What about behavioural responses to stress? So what do we do to try and cope with that ongoing or chronic stress? We might make poorer food choices. This could be things like comfort eating, eating more, or turning to fast food because it's easier and doesn't require that time and effort when we're focused on dealing with stress. We might move less. So it could be something obvious like stopping going to the gym as we just feel like we don't have time. Or maybe we spend more of our leisure time on the couch when we used to get out in the garden. Or we spend extra time lying in bed in the morning. We might withdraw socially. So we don't feel like going out to dinner with a friend. Or it could be too much effort to make those regular calls to friends and family. Sleeping less. So this is a more obvious one that a lot of us probably relate to, that we often go to bed thinking and worrying about stresses in our life, which makes it hard to get to sleep. And our routine might also be disturbed, where we start going to bed later and later, or we're eating late at night, and then that makes it hard to sleep. We might engage in more behaviours that are risky to our health, like smoking, drinking too much, or turning to other substances, sometimes as a way to calm us or to forget about our troubles. Most of us will identify at least a couple of these that might be part of our individual way of coping with the stresses that we've had. Again, it will be very individual. Interestingly, all of these stress response behaviours are linked with pain and arthritis. So the very things that some of us are doing to cope with stress could also be contributing to the development or ongoing symptoms of our arthritis conditions. Now, this slide is a bit of a summary of how chronic stress can get under skin and influence our health over time. So that concept of allostatic load that I mentioned before. So we start with a potential stressor, and the pivotal question is that stressful to me? If so, there is perceived stress. We remember that all of this is influenced by our individual genes, past experiences, and the current situation that we're in. That perceived stress leads to physiological responses like increased blood pressure that we discussed before, and also behavioural responses. Furthermore, those behavioural responses can then create more physiological changes. Over time, if the stress continues, these stress responses lead to long-term changes or allostatic loading that can then affect our health. Okay, so the good news is there are lots of things that we can do to counteract this stress in our lives and to reduce that allostatic load. And Sally's going to talk more about these after. So now we have an idea of what stress is, what happens when we're stressed, and how persistent or chronic stress can affect our health and lead to arthritis. But that's a fair bit of theory I've given so far. What does the research actually say? Well, until recently, no one really knew. The research field of stress and health was steadily building, and the thought was that stress and arthritis could be connected too, but no one had really looked at how much research was out there or what exactly to support the link between chronic stress and arthritis. So as part of my Masters of Research, we conducted a major review aiming to locate all of the existing research on chronic stress and arthritis. And this study was published a couple of years ago. So we looked for research articles that focused on chronic stress or factors that could be considered chronic stressors. And we looked for research on any type of arthritis condition. And what did we find? So we actually found quite a lot. We found 54 studies, and they spanned nearly 50 years. So we were pretty surprised by this, that not only is there quite a lot of research out there about stress and arthritis, but it goes back quite a long time. So people have been thinking about stress and arthritis actually, since the 70s. That said, more than half of the studies were published since 2010. So a lot of this is quite contemporary. So 9 of the studies that we found actually asked people with arthritis what were their beliefs about the cause of their arthritis. And 5 of those studies identified some kind of stress as a cause. And we then sort of classified those into a few different categories. So stressful life events, these might be things like a loss of a close loved one, a distressing event such as violence, work-related stresses, so feeling overworked or burnt out, and psychological stress, or just a feeling of stress generally. Most of the individuals that participated in these studies had rheumatoid arthritis, and there were some with spondyloarthritis or osteoarthritis. I've just picked out a few quotes from one of the rheumatoid arthritis studies that asked people what they thought had contributed to the onset of their arthritis. So 6 years ago, my elder sister became ill and died within 12 months. It was an extremely difficult time for me. I lived with constant worry, uncertainty, powerlessness, and mental exhaustion due to my son. I've had a great lack of sleep for several years, and all this has affected me badly. During the past 3 years, I've been living under great time pressure and mental strain. I received no support from my bosses. So you can see these are all quite different stresses, but they are all chronic or long-lasting. And these participants really felt that they were certainly part of the reason that they developed rheumatoid arthritis. Sorry. We also looked at another type of research study where the researchers had tried to measure chronic stress and whether they had arthritis or not. And there was a large number of these studies, 45. Most of these studies were done on very big groups of people, often thousands of participants. As you might suspect, chronic stress is a bit of a tricky thing to put into numbers, and there were lots of different ways that researchers had measured it. So again, we kind of categorized it into different types of stresses. So some studies use checklists of adverse events that might have occurred either in childhood or across the lifetime, and how many had participants experienced. Other studies asked about one specific type of stressor, like war or work or environmental. And then some studies use questionnaires to see how much stress the research participants had been feeling over a certain period of time. And then there was one study that even measured the physiological kind of changes that we talked about occurring in chronic stress, like blood pressure and inflammation levels. So most of the studies, that is 36 out of 45, which equates to 80%, found that there was a link between being exposed to more chronic stress and having an arthritis condition. And this link was found across a range of different categories of chronic stress and different ways of measuring the chronic stress. And so this gives us a lot more confidence in the findings that this is a true relationship. When considering why this link might exist, researchers often thought it was due to chronic physiological changes in the stress response systems and chronic inflammation. And this really fits with that allostatic load theory that we talked about earlier. I just want to highlight one of the studies that we found in particular. This was an Australian study of over 12,000 women. And the researchers asked the women to rate how stressed they felt about certain areas of life, including personal relationships, their health, their family members' health, and money. And it followed the women up for several years and asked them if they had arthritis. Now, in those who didn't have arthritis, those with higher levels of chronic stress were more likely to later develop arthritis. And this risk was similar to having a high BMI or body mass index. Interestingly, they also found that women who had arthritis already consistently reported higher levels of chronic stress than those without arthritis. So this study provides strong support for the role of chronic stress in developing arthritis. It also suggests that stress may contribute to arthritis symptoms, and arthritis may contribute to maintaining those higher stress levels. So for many of you listening with arthritis, this is probably not that surprising to you and seems like common sense, but it's good to see it, in a research study being shown as well. So I'll just sum up what I've talked about before I hand over to Sally. We know that stress is a normal part of living, and too much stress can change the way our body works and affect our health. Our body's response to stresses is highly individualized. And research suggests that chronic stress is related to developing arthritis and may also make arthritis symptoms like pain worse. It is still hard for us to know for certain, does chronic stress really cause arthritis? This is a very difficult thing to prove in research, but the evidence is growing and the theory behind it is strong. And quite possibly, it's a two-way relationship where chronic stress influences arthritis and then arthritis influences chronic stress. And can we reverse the effects of chronic stress? Again, this needs more research. We know we can't turn back the clock, but we certainly can do a lot of things to help reduce the effects of stress. And this is what is going to lead into Sally talking now. So thank you for listening to me, and I'll finish this off and pass back to Sally. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. And thanks, Ben, for the introduction. I'm here to talk a little bit from the point of view that, okay, well, now we have a diagnosis, or now we're living with arthritis, and sometimes we can feel like it's too late to make a difference to our health, but it's definitely not the case, and it's never too late to get started. I'll be sharing some tips on how to make small changes that can add up to really big benefits for your health. So while managing stress won't take us back in time and change where we are today, like Sarah said, the research does tell us that stress management strategies can make a difference to the quality of life that we have ahead of us. Specifically, stress management interventions can significantly improve pain intensity we experience, depression, and symptoms of arthritis. So to reiterate what Sarah just talked about, ongoing research continues to show that arthritis and stress impact one another. So arthritis symptoms increase our stress. Stress then worsens our arthritis symptoms, and then worsened symptoms increase stress. And what we get is that sort of spiral pattern that you can see in the image. And this kind of pattern can eventually result in things like persistent low mood and poor coping, which makes it even harder to manage your health and to feel good. If you consider for a moment, which feels most within your control, arthritis or stress? If we want to slow down a spiraling cycle like the one in the image, we need to change one of the elements. I'm sure you'd agree that removing the arthritis symptoms would be the best idea. And while I wish this was possible for everybody, we must be realistic about the energy and the influence that we can use in the best kind of way. If we find ways to reduce the impact of stress, just a tiny bit at a time, the spiraling cycle will actually begin to slow down. Okay, this is a very simple diagram of sort of what's happening in your nervous system when a stressor is perceived. And in order to understand how stress is managed by our brain and body, we need to have a basic understanding of what's going on here. So the stressors at the top, your brain interprets various sensory inputs, and also our thoughts as stressors. This can range from things like bad dreams, someone yelling at you, stubbing a toe, waking up with stiffness or pain in the morning, or maybe something even scarier like a bus, just missing you when you're crossing the road. Your brain passes this information to your nervous system. Okay, so that's the stressor part. Then the central nervous system, it's kind of like the wiring from your brain to your organs. So it controls things like your autonomous heartbeat and your semi-autonomous breathing. It knows you better than you do, or it likes to think it does, and it controls this balance in your nervous system that tries to recalibrate responses depending on what's going on in your life and your experience on a daily basis. External stressors that are sensed by your nervous system and your brain trigger changes in your chemistry in your body, like Sarah said. And that change signals your endocrine system and your immune system to take action with chemistry and neurotransmitter behavior. But what we're going to talk about is just this part here. So the stressors and then what happens in our central nervous system in response to that. Okay, so like Sarah mentioned, there are different types of stressors. Some are in our control and others are not. And they look different for everybody. Identifying the stressors that impact you personally is an important part of managing your stress. So the first one we'll talk about is our thoughts or perception. This is your perception of your experience that translates your thoughts, emotions, and moods into that physical manifestation throughout your nervous system. Negative perception or negative thoughts can lead to a stress response in your body. Unhelpful behaviors can be stressors. Things that upset the balance in our bodies, such as disrupted sleep, poor nutrition, or an absence of exercise, can cause a stress response. And moderation is key here. Doing too little or too much of anything can be problematic. And lastly, stressors can be environmental. So things that are external to us can impact on our well-being, such as pollution, our access to sunlight, and even simple changes in the weather. Some of these stresses, like Sarah said, they're acute, and others are chronic. The acute ones, they come, we have a response, and then they go. And other ones result in chronic and persisting high levels of stress. It can be a helpful exercise to actually take 10 minutes at some point and brainstorm, have a think about what are your personal stressors. We have a lot in our heads, but sometimes we actually need to write them down to see what we're actually dealing with. So if stressors are the input, our nervous system acts kind of like the processor of that information. So this is a very simple, again, diagram of your nervous system, and you can see there that it's divided up into different branches and they all perform different functions. So once you've identified your personal stressors, it's helpful to work out what does that cause to happen in my nervous system. You can see there that the autonomic or automatic part of your nervous system is split into two branches, and that's what we're going to focus on tonight. These things, like it says, happen automatically. When a stressor is perceived by our brain, we activate one particular system. If it's stressful or if we require a stress response, then our sympathetic response is activated. If we're feeling safe and we're not under stress, we're more likely to be in a parasympathetic state, or that response is going to be able to be active. So you might have heard of the fight or flight response, and we talk about that one quite a bit. You're probably more likely to have heard about that. But the parasympathetic response is equally as important, and it doesn't get as much airtime, unfortunately. And I'm going to try to change that tonight because it's a really, really powerful tool to use in managing stress. Neither system is better than the other. We need them both, and we need them to be working together well. You can see in this diagram that they work, so they kind of work in tandem. So when, say, for example, in the image, the snake is chasing you and you need that acute stress response, sympathetic response fires up. Okay, we have that fight or flight response, all the chemistry in our body changes, and we do what we need to do to get away from it. And then once the threat is gone, the snake maybe goes off in another direction or you run away, then your parasympathetic response starts to recalibrate. And it's a bit of a seesaw. While one's activated, the other one is less active and vice versa. So what happens in a healthy nervous system, one that's operating well, is that the sympathetic and the parasympathetic responses move sort of up and down. So you can see there that when the stressor is present, sympathetic response increases and then it settles. And then we activate again and then it settles. And we're doing this all the time. There's nothing wrong with that. That's what we were designed to do. But what we want to happen is for that to happen within our window of tolerance. And a window of tolerance is kind of like a bandwidth that we all have. And again, the bandwidth is dependent on our resources, our experience, our health, lots of different factors. And what we want ideally is for that up and down to happen within the lines. What can happen if we're getting too much sympathetic response is that we experience sort of chronic symptoms. Things can go out of the lines, and that's where we experience distress, and that's where it can become problematic. What we would call that technically is hyperarousal, okay? And that can feel like anxiety. It can feel like panic for some people. Other people don't notice it so much, but it can be a state of chronic stress, okay? Our muscles are more likely to carry tension, which can increase our pain. And that inflammatory response in the other parts of our nervous system can make inflammatory forms of arthritis more damaging to our joints. The takeaway from here is that stress fluctuations are normal and stress is manageable so long as it remains within our window of tolerance. Our sympathetic and our parasympathetic responses work to maintain a balance, and that ideally neither response is dominant for too long. So the ups and downs are fine. That's what we were designed to do. So what happens when our stressors cause our sympathetic response to flow outside of the bandwidth or outside of the lines of our window of tolerance? Earlier, we spoke about the different types of stressors present in daily life. Do you remember what came to mind for you? How many of these stressors do you think is it easy to remove from your life? Wouldn't it be easy to just reduce the stressors to recalibrate your system? We could just remain in our window of tolerance if we took away the stressors. But how realistic is that? We're often told to reduce stress, just take things away and things will get better. But how reasonable is that to do in modern life? And what are the sorts of things we take away first? Unfortunately, it's usually the things that we actually enjoy. What if a more effective and sustainable approach was to increase our window of tolerance? So we're actually better placed to manage the fluctuations in our nervous system response without experiencing that overwhelming distress. So if we have more bandwidth and ability to be resilient, our nervous system is less likely to produce a long and persisting stress response. If we think of our nervous system a bit like a traffic light system, we start to appreciate that our green zone is where that up and down ebb and flow pattern is in balance. It's okay, it's operating within our bandwidth. And then we can see that the amber zone is where we start to get warning signs that we're getting close to the edge of that bandwidth and maybe we need to take some action. And then the red zone is distress. That's where we experience that hyperarousal. And if we exist in that state for a long time, we start to have those sort of changes in our bodies as a result of chronic stress. Where do you think is the best place to sort of practice and implement stress management strategies? Some people, they wait until they're in the red zone, and by then it's a little bit too late. Ideally, what we want to be doing is operating within this balanced area. Our brain learns best when things are in balance. Our brain learns best when we're not stressed. So if we're implementing new strategies, we want to do them every day, regardless of kind of what's going on, not wait until we're really distressed. Now, if you think that that's an extra thing that you've got to do, and a lot of us have got very busy lives, so we feel like we can't add anything to our day, I'm going to challenge you and say that that probably sounds like a mindset issue rather than anything else, because we're all doing this. We've all learned how to do these sorts of things. And I'll use brushing your teeth as an example. I'd say most of us, if not all of us, brush our teeth regularly. And we don't do this because something terrible has happened. We do this because it's part of our daily lives. It's part of looking after our teeth. We wouldn't just let our teeth erode with cavities Because at some point in life, we learnt that it was really important to brush our teeth. That's the difference between what we engage in and what we don't. We learn that it matters. If we value stress management and we prioritize it, then it becomes important and we do it, just like brushing our teeth. So some practical tips. To start with something small. You don't need to do everything all at once. Quality over quantity is important, so be consistent and don't try to do too many things. Doing one thing is plenty if you can start to implement it and make it part of your daily life. Focus on strategies that feel best for you. Prioritize stress management just like you would other forms of healthcare, and connect it with something else you already do. So, you know, if you like, and we'll talk about things that we can do, but if you like music, put it on while you're getting ready for your day. You know, incorporate it into your life, so it's not an extra task. It just becomes the feel-good part of the things that you already do. How many times have you been told that reducing stress is good for you, and that eating a healthy diet is good for you, and that exercising is important? And how many times have you found it difficult to make a change and actually stick to it? And why do you think this is? Do you think it's about laziness? Do you think you lack motivation? Whenever we're considering a behaviour change, the most crucial but often missed step is to explore how our beliefs influence our thoughts about the issue. So take a moment and ask yourself honestly, what do you actually believe about stress? What do you believe about investing in stress management strategies? And where does it sit on the ever-growing list of important things you have to do every day? If we're really honest with ourselves and we take some time to write down our beliefs without judgment, what we usually find is a whole lot of lessons that we learn from other people. Some of them are helpful and some of them aren't. Some beliefs I've heard are, I don't have time to look after myself. It's too hard. I have other responsibilities that are more important. It's selfish to do things that manage my stress. Or, no, I feel lazy if I'm doing those sorts of things. You might have something else that goes on for you. But I want to challenge those things because a lot of them came from places that don't really fit with the lives that they're leading now. So in order to do this, we need to make good choices. Okay, recognizing I have a choice here, getting curious with what that might be, what your automatic response is generally. Where does that usually land you? If you take the same steps and take the same action that you always have, where are you going to end up? Probably in the same place that you are now. So how could I make a different choice? And how might that impact on my well-being? A big part of engaging your parasympathetic response in your nervous system is to find what feels good. And what comes to mind when I say that? A lot of us have lost touch with what feels good. Our days are full of pain, fatigue, responsibility, frustration, and repetition. Some people have learnt to feel good by serving others, prioritising things outside of themselves, family, work, household tasks, the things that positive stress helps us to do, the things that feel non-negotiable, that we wouldn't question whether they need to be done or not. But the result of this is that we spend so much time and energy doing these things that we lose sight of what feels good for us, our mind, our body, and our spirit. Stress can cause life to feel fast, heavy, chaotic, overwhelming. Stress can make us feel buzzed, agitated, under pressure, and can result in a rush. What do you think is happening in your nervous system? Sympathetic response is being activated. Introducing breathing as an experiment is a good way to experience your parasympathetic response. If you take even maybe 3 or 4 breaths, just with the timing of this image, what you might notice is that everything just slows down a little bit. If we think about our nervous system having that response, then what we're giving it is permission to just slow down for a little bit. And that's what we want. That's that parasympathetic response engaging, and that's what's going to help recalibrate our system. So what is it that feels good for you? Because this is the key. We need to do more of this. We need to factor more of this into life as part of our healthcare. Some things might be gardening, dancing or listening to music, singing, which has the added benefit of the diaphragmatic breathing, creating art, whether it be colouring in, drawing, painting, pottery, craft, engaging in mindfulness, and it doesn't have to be meditation. It could be prayer or spiritual practice, guided relaxation, journaling, mindful movement like Tai Chi or yoga. It could be something simple as spending time in nature, walking, sitting, reading, putting your feet in the grass. These are just a handful of ideas, and it doesn't really matter what the activity is, as long as it feels good for you. It's going to feel good for your nervous system. Okay. Just conscious of time, I'll just spend a few more minutes. I just want you to have a think about, how would you describe your body? Just take a second and think, what are the words you use to describe your body now that you have arthritis, or someone close to you, experiences arthritis? What do you hear them say about their bodies? In my work in the rheumatology unit, I ask the group members to tell me what they think about their bodies. And I hear words like, it's worn out, it's ugly, it's tired, it's painful, it's slow, or it's broken. And the group we're currently running, one of the lovely women that we are working with, started with those words. And the last sentence that she used was, and it's also my home. And that's true for all of us. We get one body. And unfortunately, when we experience a chronic health condition like arthritis, we can lose a healthy connection with our body. The body that previously did things without pain, without stiffness, fatigue, or flares, and the body that was more agile with a mind that was sharper, has changed, and it will likely to continue to change as we move through life. We wish our body would be different in some way, or like it was before. We learned earlier that our thoughts play a big role in how we feel about things and the behaviours we choose to engage in. I know myself, if I'm thinking negatively about the capacity of my body, I'm likely to feel down and frustrated. Then I'm going to be more likely to choose a behaviour that will make things worse. What do you feel like doing when you're frustrated with your body? Probably not the things that are going to make you feel good. Part of the stress management for arthritis and other chronic conditions involves befriending your body. So employing the same kindness that we give to the people around us and learning to believe in our capacity again. It's not going to look like it did before, but it can look a lot better than it does now. These are some of the things that we can do to befriend our bodies. We can think about it with kindness. The main thing is to be open and curious about what's possible. If we start to look after our bodies like the home that it previously was, or that we'd like it to be, the things that we do start to change, and then our body responds in a really positive way. Sometimes we need a different perspective to help us make sense of things. Now, I'm a psychologist, specifically a health psychologist, and other mental health professionals do a lot more than help people with mental illness. We're trained to support people to make behaviour change easier and more sustainable, and we can help with things like motivation, habits, goal setting, and maintaining progress. You don't need to have anxiety or depression or a diagnosis of something in the mental health space to see a psychologist. Okay, so our nervous system was designed to manage stress. It wasn't designed to manage chronic stress. Self-awareness is the first step. Taking action is what makes the difference. Conscious decision-making is the key. Saying no to the unhelpful defaults, the things we've always done before, and saying yes to making a better choice is how we can move forward. I'd encourage you to start where you are. Stress won't reduce if we keep wishing, hoping, and wanting the past to be different. Use what you have. We don't need a lot to start implementing something into everyday life that will promote that parasympathetic response. You can start with your breath. You can start with a pen and paper and a curious mind, or by playing a song and just letting your foot tap freely with a smile on your face. Little things often, while we are paying attention to how good they feel, is the aim. Finally, please only do what you can. Stress management is about feeling good, not putting pressure on ourselves. It's going to look different than before, and that's okay. What's not okay is letting go of the things that matter most to us. And that's me done. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much for that, Sally and Sarah. That was fantastic. And that there was so many, it's great to see that in the stress viewed in, two different lights, but in the same light overall. It's a fantastic presentation by both of you, and really thank everyone for both of you for presenting and everyone for coming along. The questions and answers are open if anyone has any. I will also say, Sally, you talked a little bit about music and stress, and I'll raise that here at our Welland office if anyone's located near the CBD, that we actually have a music therapy program starting, the music therapy student running programs to help kind of deal with the mental health side and those stresses around arthritis, which is sounding like a very positive thing. I'll ask a question from it as well. With the studies, Sarah, were there any differences between kind of the more inflammatory types of arthritis and stress compared to osteoarthritis and things like that?
Yeah. The vast majority of the studies, so I'm not sure off the top of my head, but probably 3/4 of the studies looked at arthritis generally. So the questions that they would have asked the participants was, do you have arthritis, or have you been diagnosed with arthritis? So they really kind of, for most of the studies, it grouped it under that sort of umbrella without being able to kind of tease out the specifics quite so much. I guess we know within that umbrella that most of those people would have osteoarthritis, purely because osteoarthritis is so much, more common than the inflammatory arthropathies. But yeah, and they were the ones that showed the most obvious results. Most of the specific arthritis conditions, there was maybe only 1 or 2 studies on where they just looked at psoriatic arthritis or just looked at spondyloarthritis. So you can't really glean as much from those results, I'd say. But if we consider arthritis as a whole, that's where we have a good evidence base that, yes, stress and arthritis are related.
Perfect. Thank you for that. Sally, I'll ask you a question. If with kind of talking about seeing other healthcare professionals and psychologists, more specifically, or someone like yourself, can you comment on what could you say is probably, if someone tonight's thinking, oh, this would be a great way for me to, like, this is sounding like it's resonating with me and I'd like to start that journey of seeing those other healthcare professionals. Can you comment on what's the best way to go about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I would recommend that they book an appointment with their GP and speak to them about, depending on what their needs are. Some people might be eligible for a mental health care plan, which gives them access to subsidised sessions with a psychologist, 10 in a calendar year, which can go a long way to sort of funding that. Or alternatively, there are sort of chronic disease management plans that incorporate psychological care as well. So it can be specific to your condition. So you don't have to have a mental health diagnosis to be able to see a psychologist to manage your healthcare. And that will give you access for up to 5, depending on what sort of combination with other health professionals you have, but up to 5. And you can actually achieve quite a bit with a psychologist in 1 or 2 sessions if your aim is to just break down some of those barriers and understand what's getting in the way for you. So yeah, I'd encourage people to give it a shot. I know it can be scary, and people don't talk about it maybe as much as going and seeing the doctor, but it can be so helpful in changing the trajectory of your health and just your well-being, how you feel about your life.
Perfect. Thank you for that. We've got a question coming from someone for you, Sally, and they're asking from a professional perspective, for a person who's been living with high levels of stress, does it take them a bit more work to return to a balance than a person who has been living with like mid or mild levels of stress?
Yeah, it's a great question. I would say yes. Anything that our brain habituates to or gets used to, or our bodies trying its very best to look after us, but sometimes it gets very, very good at sustaining a pattern. And if we've experienced high stress for a long period of time, it can take quite a while for our system to recalibrate and recognize that it's safe not to respond in that way. It's absolutely possible, but it might take a bit more homework. It doesn't mean that you need to see a professional, that many more times. It might just mean that it takes a bit longer, or it might take a bit more daily practice to do that.
Perfect. Thank you for that. Another person has asked mainly about that mental health care plan, and they're asking if their GP thinks to seem them more resilient than they feel, and has not given them a mental health care plan. And this might be outside of your realm. Do you know if other health professionals, like their rheumatologist, can refer one for that?
Generally they would come from a GP. I always say to people, because I hear this a little bit actually in the groups that I work with, that they're not getting the response from their GP that perhaps they're hoping for, or maybe their coping style is to appear really stoic and resilient, but underneath they're actually not coping very well. It can either be seeing a different GP and trying maybe a different therapeutic relationship in that space and seeing if you get a different response. But it can also be about breaking down some of our coping mechanisms and being really vulnerable with our healthcare providers and saying, I'm actually not doing okay and I really need this support. So you could kind of go one of sort of two ways with that.
Yeah.
Perfect. Well, I'd like to thank everyone for coming along tonight. We do have a few more questions and we'll do our best to email those out and answer to you if we haven't had time to answer you. Sarah and Sally, I'd like to really thank you both very much for your time, and I'd like to thank everyone very much for coming along. I hope you enjoy the rest of your night, and thank you very much again.
Thanks, Ben.